Welcome to the Skills World Live radio show, sponsored by OneFile, a world where everyone is learning for their future. Stay tuned for all the news, views and interviews in association with FE News.
It's that time of the week again, folks. I'm Tom Bewick. Welcome to Skills World Live. And in a week when the nation was gripped by football fever once again, England put the Danes to the sword at Wembley, making it to their first major final since 1966. Talking of living memory, there were plenty of peers in the House of Lords this week who could still remember 1946. Never mind the controversial Jeff Hurst goal. Did the ball cross the line? One thing we now know for sure is that the government's skills bill is struggling to get across any sense, but it adds up to a coherent piece of primary legislation. Not that it stopped Lady After Baron getting up on their feet in the chamber this week to tell the government minister, Baroness Berridge, that if revisions to the bill are not more forthcoming, the only thing that will be coming to her home in future will be the postwoman with her P45. Yeah, for those of you that sat through 5 hours of committee stage in the Lords this week, my heart goes out to you. At times, their lordships delivered up more exhausted watching than that jaw-dropping moment when we thought England captain Harry Kane had missed the penalty goal. Indeed, we saw a number of bravura performances in the upper house this week, including a shell-shocking speech from the Tory peer and former Education Secretary, Lord Baker. He got to his feet lambasting his own party for presiding over, since 2010, and in quotes, educational apartheid. Yeah, the author of the truly seminal 1988 Education Act told the government, his own government, in effect, this bill was taking the country completely in the opposite direction of where it needed to go. The parlon continued from Labour peers as well. The usually mild-mannered Lord Adonis, former schools minister and educational policy Svengali to the Blair governments. He took aim and fired a straight shot at civil servants for badly advising ministers and creating reams of paper of platitudes and complete nonsense. And don't just take my word for it. Check out this passage from the debate.
In my experience of big change in education, the biggest changes are usually produced by the smallest pieces of legislation, and they particularly focus on funding, because the one thing the government controls in this is funding. In parenthesis, further education funding is declining, my lords. Let's not get away from that. No amount of legislation, no white papers extending to whatever this latest one is that's in very large type, but it extends to 73 pages. None of that can make up for the fact that funding is being cut. There is some opportunity for substituting public funding with private funding through the loan scheme, but public funding is being cut, my lords. That's one way you can do it. The second is by great ministerial and civil service drive on the ground, my lords, which we desperately need. Desperately in this sector, but this sector has had, by my calculation, one Minister of Further Education each year since 2010. The only one who was any good was sacked and now chairs the Select Committee in the House of Commons, I think because he was actually too committed to actually making a reality of improving further education. And the one big reform in this area, the one big reform, which is the apprenticeship levy, has been so badly mishandled that astonishingly it's managed to lead to a decline in the number of apprentices, particularly apprentices at entry level, which is the area where we have the biggest skills failures, my lords. So this is an absolutely farcical piece of legislation. I have the noble lady, the Minister, has my deep commiserations on having to spend hour after hour camped in this House proclaiming mantras and platitudes which will have been written for her by civil servants, which will do absolutely zero to improve.
Meanwhile, over on the independent crossbenches, the former FE lecturer and Baroness Fox of Buckley, that's Claire Fox to you and me, brought some blushes to my own cheeks when she read out a day job quote of mine to the noble lords.
What Tom Bewick, the Chief Executive of the Federation of Awarding Bodies, calls a top-down power grab on qualifications, and to quote him, he says, "It is regrettable that the provisions of this bill and the government's wider qualifications review seeks to stifle investment, innovation and choice in the future of effectively nationalising technical qualifications via a Whitehall-driven, top-down command and control approach.
There are so many amendments now to this bill that the business managers are having to make more committee time available. Safe to say, here at Skills World Live, we'll continue to follow and report on the unfolding Skills Bill saga.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Bewick.
On today's programme, we're sticking with their lordships by debating whether the Baker clause on careers advice is past its sell-by date. Listeners last week will remember that Robert Halford MP, chair of the Commons Select Committee, told me that securing better careers support, including the slug of additional taxpayers' money shout out to the Careers and Enterprise Company recently, was giving him some real cause for concern. Being the fair community radio broadcaster that we are, I invited Ollie de Botton, that's the new chief of the Careers Company, to appear on this show, but his PR minders politely declined. Well, Monsieur de Botton, if at any time you decide to appear to account for your organisation's performance, then we gratefully will ensure that our airwaves are here and always open. Stay tuned, folks, for some great guest interviews coming up. Some top tunes as well, including a-ha's 80s classic, Take On Me. But first, get your ears around this up-to-date banger from Thomas Marshall, aka DJ Marsh, and a track called Heaven.
Partners works across the UK education and skills sector to transform leadership and inspire societal change. We do this through executive search, recruitment, and board development services. If your organisation requires support to appoint great leaders through a thorough and national search campaign, or perhaps your board has a skills gap which needs filling, contact Peridot for an informal discussion about how we can help you. We love what we do, and we do it with passion. So search online for Peridot Partners or email education@peridotpartners.co.uk.
Let's find out now what's been making the news headlines in your skills world this week. A report by the Learning and Work Institute published this week has found that university graduates are over 4 times more likely to access further training throughout their life than those with no qualifications. Just 11% of workers in lower paid so-called elementary jobs were likely to receive training. Meanwhile, in 2020, 1/3 of graduates received some workplace training. The report also found that UK workers get half the amount spent on their training compared to European Union countries, and that total employer investment in skills has declined by 20 million fewer days compared to 2011. In other news, the House of Commons Education Select Committee has endorsed the appointment of Dr. Joe Saxton as the next Chief Regulator at Ofqual. The opposition Labour Party had said the former Multi-Academy Trust chief was unqualified for the role and raised doubts about her controversial management record in running the Turner Schools in Kent. And finally, after over a decade since founding and then editing FE Week, Nick Linford announced he was passing on the reins this week. From August, the Association of Colleges' current regional director, Shane Chowan, will take over editing the title, which in the past has exposed multiple college scandals and government incompetence in FE and skills delivery. Everyone here at Skills World Live wishes Nick all the very best in his new role.
Contact us at Skills World Live. We want to hear from you. Email skillsworld@fenews.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter at Skills World Live, at Tom Bewick. Use the hashtag Skills World Live. Call us on 02032 900 111. That's 02032 900 111.
Welcome back to Skills World Live. Thanks for staying with us. Now, cast your minds back to the kind of careers advice you received at school. Did you know what you wanted to be at the ages of 16, 18 or even 21? Indeed, thinking back to those age-related milestones and looking at what you're actually doing now for a living is probably a world away from what you once imagined. It certainly is for me. At 16, I managed to fail nearly all of my O-levels. That's GCSEs in new money. And now, look at what I'm doing for a day job, representing the very same qualifications organisations I once had a problem with passing. The point then is this: like so many people that age, that tender age, I didn't really know what I wanted to do exactly, but getting back into education, albeit via the night school route, did of course eventually set me up for a 25-year career that I've enjoyed so far in the FE and skills sector. Nevertheless, we live in times where almost no one I speak to seems happy with the current state of information and advice and guidance, or IAG in the jargon, and it seems careers support is just as poor for adults as it is for young people. For years, policymakers have talked about an integrated all-age careers advice and support service. Instead, what we've got is a mishmash of fragmented quangos, perverse incentives for school leaders, and various online initiatives. Ruth Gilbert, the Group Education Director of the privately funded foundation, the Manor Group, is on a crusade to change the whole way the careers sector works. Ruth, good morning to you. Thanks so much for coming on.
Pleasure.
Now, we're talking all about careers advice today and the Baker Clause. Why do you think, after nearly 30 years of various reports and commissions and debates and different organisations that have been set up, often backed by taxpayers' money, why is there still a sense in the sector that we haven't got careers advice and guidance right?
Well, I think fundamentally it's because we've not addressed the elephant in the room, which is the who is appropriate to deliver careers education effectively and keep it current. We place lots of responsibilities on lots of different people, subject specialists in schools, trained to be teachers in their subject. They're not going to be experts and may not have any industry experience. Careers leaders, equally, how do they stay current? How do they know all the changes that are going on and where all the skill shortages are? And, the funding initiatives into independent schemes like Connections, Prospects, other bodies that have developed over a period of years have really, not been given, I think, the opportunity to do the whole job. We've separated adults from young people. We've segmented the market. We provide some things online, some things face-to-face. I think it's very confusing. So I think we need to be clear about the purpose of education and the purpose of educators and who is best to do this. And I wonder if now is probably the perfect time to really pick up, for me, the biggest elephant, which is the role of industry in this.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that, because you wrote in an article around reform of secondary education, I think 2019, that it was really time to be bolder and braver in this space. And what did you mean by that?
Yes, that's right, Tom. Well, fundamentally, that the world is changing, and it's changing at such a rate that, if I think about this as a parent, I don't know what the construction industry looks like now. I don't know about the 200 plus healthcare jobs that I understand have been referenced in broad terms in the press. I know about doctors and nurses. So what I'm trying to say is we don't know what we don't know. So how can we make informed choices? Well, we need to integrate industry far more and employers into that voice. But we also need to stop pretending that schools and colleges have either the time or the expertise or indeed the impetus to provide that broader, open, accessibility to industry, to evolving opportunities, to areas like engineering, data, analytics, things that aren't part of the national curriculum. And accept that, therefore, we need to provide a regional service. We need to stop thinking that schools will not want to fill their sixth forms, that they won't want to make sure that students progress, because actually they're incentivized to do that, to stay financially sustainable. And therefore, we need to be much more in tune with labour market information. We need to create regional opportunities to come together in a more cohesive way. And certainly what I've been looking at over the last 3 years is the international experience and how this is done elsewhere.
Well, let's just come on in a second into what your specific organisation is doing. But I just want to wind back a little bit about, to something you said about the fact that, the jobs of the next 10 years aren't even known yet, certainly not to young people. There are actually 75,000 occupations if you went to a website like Indeed.com, looking for a job. So the labour market's hugely complex. Do you think part of the challenge, Ruth, around this whole area, particularly, for example, in that 11 to 18-year-old phase, and I take your point about we don't have in this country, unlike others, an integrated youth and adult careers service. But do you think part of the challenge and part of the problem is there is still this sense that somehow an 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old should already know potentially what they want to do? And in fact, the nature of careers, the nature of jobs, is it's less about saying, this is what I want to do at the age of 14 when I'm 20, 25, 35. It's more about how do we create a system, an ecosystem of careers, support, advice and guidance that gives, as you say, more exposure to industry, more opportunities for young people to sample and to taste. I mean, again, this is one of the features of the Swiss model. Even before those upper secondary students make their final commitment to a particular apprenticeship placement, they have loads of opportunities to sample different employers, different pathways. I forget the German word for it. My partner told me this a few weeks ago, who speaks German. But the point is we don't have that infrastructure. And that sort of suggests to me what's going wrong with the likes of the Careers and Enterprise Company. What are they doing? What's their responsibility in all of this?
Well, their responsibility is changing. I saw recently Nick Gibb made a statement about the CEC getting involved now in ensuring commitments to work placements and industry placements and more employer engagement are met. But actually, the CEC has a remit and to train the trainers, to train the careers leaders, whereas the National Careers Service is a front-facing, predominantly adult service that obviously changed during lockdown last year to add the opportunity to service young people. So the CC is not a provider of careers education. It's a provider of support, training, employer network brokerage to support careers educators in regions across the UK. So I think it's a tall order to expect any of these individual bodies to be able to do everything. Yes, we need to train the trainer. Yes, we need to upskill and we need to help with employer brokerage. But actually, what you're describing, Tom, and what I've seen from, as you say, the Swiss system, Finland, Norway, parts of Canada and Australia, is they stop trying to make every individual school and college lead on everything. And actually create a regional infrastructure. So it's far more efficient. And moreover, employers and admissions officers for universities get really fed up and can't service every individual school. They can't visit everyone. They can't provide tours for every individual organisation. But at a regional level, if we look at the system in Finland, they have regional centres where they run events, not just during the school day or college day, but also evenings and weekends. And it's more about educating the community at large, because let's think about this. It's parents who often have the biggest influence on choices that young people make. And how many 13-year-olds really know what they want to do? They're more likely to know what they don't like.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think we need to draw on those international standards, and we need to create regional community hubs where there is exposure in an informed, impartial way to what industry wants. There are talks, there are virtual tours, there are Q&As, there are events that really supplement what can realistically be done in the school environment, often with the school having just one or two careers leaders, and also stop that pressure for employers and admissions officers to engage with all of these institutions individually, which is just not
crazy,
viable.
Isn't it? I mean, it's just, I mean, you know, best will in the world, there just isn't the bandwidth at the school level to engage in all of those areas. But still, as you're pointing out, there has been too often, though, also a tendency of schools, colleges, sixth forms, and it's one level perhaps understandable. You know, they want to hold on to the students. They want to certainly hold on to the money. And don't forget, that's all underpinned by a decades-old cultural pervasive view that somehow, you know, getting your good grades at A-level and getting on to university, and all the sorts of things that we've spoken about a lot on this show with my guests. Now, tell me about Qdos, because I did download this wonderful app. Tell me about your organisation, and where do you sort of see then your whole initiative adding value and fitting in with what is quite a complex picture around careers advice and guidance at the moment in this country? Thanks,
Tom. Well, essentially, we're not reinventing the wheel. And if it ain't broke, we don't want to fix it.
Right, good.
But what we can see is broken is that cohesive support that provides the glue in a larger community and makes employers more accessible, that makes industry more accessible by not putting the onus on each individual institutions. In any region, we could be talking to 20 to 80 different schools and colleges. And you can see why in the Nordic regions, in Canada, Australia, they have created these regional hubs, because it just makes everything so much easier for young people and adults to make informed decisions. So that's what Qdos is. And, you know, the building behind me is a visual representation of a Qdos career hub.
Right.
And certainly,
and how many of those will we see around the country, Ruth?
Well, the plan is
look amazing, by the way.
Over 5 years. Thank you. But obviously, during lockdown last year, we couldn't put a digger in the ground. And as a former principal of a further and higher education college, I do appreciate the predicament of, the pressure that's put on staff to provide the guidance and support, and, balancing that with what is practical and appropriate. And I was drawn to Manor because they are really saying industry needs to put their money where their mouth is. Industry needs to lead and support creating this regional infrastructure that exists in other countries that do far more of this skills-based support. So, Tom, what you were talking about earlier with pre-14, actually getting exposure to different sectors, that needs to be very tangible, and that needs somewhere where it can be done.
Yeah, which is fantastic. And again, I've certainly noticed the fact that this is a lot of private sector money going in. This isn't about the begging bowl with government and huge amounts of grant and taxpayers' money saying, give us this dosh and we'll go and do X and Y. Look, I mean, I'm really getting the message about the regional hubs, and can't wait to see these buildings go up around the country. And as you say, being able to bring those secondary students to a facility like that, expose them to the industry experience, I think will just be amazing. Look, I've got time briefly just to ask you about the Baker clause, because that's a huge debate at the moment. Lord Baker's on the warpath, it seems to me, with this skills bill. He's been very clear he's not happy with it. He thinks it's going to potentially create a form of, in his words, educational apartheid. He obviously put through the original clause back in 2017, doesn't feel like it's working. Is there a danger, though, that if we could go too far? I mean, you've underlined some of the many problems and challenges, but is it about the long stick of the law potentially coming down on schools, parents being able to sue their schools if they don't feel like their offspring have got the effective careers advice and guidance? I mean, do we need to go that far or not, do you think?
Well, I would say no. And I say that plainly because I have the utmost respect for Lord Baker's intention here, which is to ensure that every young person can make an informed choice, which means they do need exposure to other training providers. They do need to understand opportunities that are not part of the national curriculum, that they won't naturally see in their everyday study. But the practicalities, and, with my law degree hat on, of taking this to court and, parents instigating that, it's a long and arduous process to take legal action. But I think the fundamental point that Lord Baker's making is, how do we ensure there is an incentive for schools and colleges who will naturally promote their wares to ensure that we do address the fact that UCAS has said a third of young people don't know about apprenticeships. The CEC has said that half of schools, the 2,000 schools surveyed, are still not providing accessibility to meet the standards for impartial access to other trainers.
Benchmarks, indeed, they're not being
exactly. So I think the practical point is, instead of always using a stick, we need to provide resource, and we can do that efficiently and sustainably if we capitalize on regional infrastructure. And Manor has really come up with a practical way of doing that. Manor has said, well, we will invest the capital, we will provide these community facilities, but we will need schools and colleges to engage with them.
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm talking to the head of a school sixth form later on the show, along with a former sixth form student, to talk all about that. Alas, we've run out of time. But Ruth Gilbert, Group Education Director at the Manor Group and Qdos, thanks so much for joining the programme today.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Bewick.
Everybody OneFile is the best apprenticeship e-portfolio in the world. But did you know it's ideal for all kinds of vocational training, including traineeships? OneFile is very flexible, so it has everything you need to deliver, manage, and track traineeship progress.
We're currently using OneFile for all our traineeship learners. They love it, and so do we. It's fabulous. Thank you, OneFile.
To find out more about OneFile, head to onefile.co.uk and book a demo with a member of the team.
From 2003, you heard that dance club classic from Junior Jack with Oliver Cheetham called Make Love. It's that time in the episode now when we open up the airwaves for our first three-way video chat. You heard from Ruth Gilbert earlier. She's the careers expert. Well, now we're going to hear from two people who are at the sharp end of delivery, as you might describe them. William Baldwin is the principal of Brighton and Hove Sixth Form College, Bewick, and Gemma Creamer is a university undergraduate studying law, a former care leaver. Indeed, she also volunteers as a social media advisor to the non-profit Beyond that I've co-founded as a charity in 2019. Good morning to you both. Thanks so much for coming on.
Morning.
Morning.
William, let's come to you first. I'm sure you've heard of the Baker Clause that places a statutory duty on educational settings with students in year 8 to 13 to have access to local career options. In what way does your sixth form seek to comply with the Baker Clause?
I think we get it from both ends, don't we? And firstly, thanks for having me on. And it's great to be here with Gemma, who is also an ex-Bewick student. So you'll get to hear from her whether we're getting it right. And taking it from both ends, we want to be in schools, we want to be talking to students about their options from year 8, but particularly as it begins to crystallise into year 9 options, year 10, what are their pathways going to be? And sixth form colleges is one of those, but not the right option for everyone. And it's important students hear that we are one of their options. But then also we have our own students, and almost as soon as we get them in, we need to get them thinking about, well, where are they going to go after Bewick, and what does life have in hold for them? So whilst around 70% of our students do go on to university, it's not the right destination for all of them. We need to make sure we give them an understanding of all their options, whether that's a degree apprenticeship or into the world of employment, and make sure we've laid the groundworks for that. Okay. We do that with Futures Fair, Progression Week, lots of work in tutorial, and make sure we're tailoring it to the individual.
Okay, well, let's unpack those future options and some of the things your college and perhaps others should be doing in this space. But Gemma, you're at the start of your career journey to become a barrister. How easy, though, do you think was it for you and your wider generation to access good quality careers advice as a former Bewick student? It sounds like it was quite a good experience.
I can definitely speak for myself in that careers advice from Bewick was of a high quality, but you wouldn't expect any less from one of the top colleges in Brighton and Hove. There was definitely a lot of opportunities put in front of me from the providers at Bewick, you know, not only the teachers that I had, but also the staff around the college. One specific one that I could probably give you a good example of is the Big City Bright Future initiative. This works with young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. Obviously, Tom, you touched upon that I came from foster care, so I'm now a care leaver. So I suppose I qualified for it in that sense. And that was a very challenging initiative, which I was actually very, lucky, should I say lucky, but I earned it. So I managed to secure an internship with Simmons & Simmons this summer. So I'll be interning with them, who's a city corporate and commercial law firm. But I do think that, you know, a lot of opportunities are put in front of young people, but one of the main problems is they don't often seize it, or the opportunities are put in front, but they're not necessarily equipped with the tools and resources to go forward on them. And I do think that is where maybe, you know, educational providers, not necessarily Bewick, because, you know, we are from the moment we enter that college, you know, skills, everything is drilled into us. So I do think that there could be, you know, a bit more push put in place in trying to provide the basic employment resources for young people going forward.
Well, let's come on to that now then with you, William, because there's no doubt, Baswick's got a fantastic reputation in Brighton and Hove, and indeed nationally. I mean, some of your progression and attainment figures to some of the country's top universities are well known. So in that sense, there isn't a criticism, is there, really, around of the post-16 system and choices at the moment, in terms of you are on that academic track and you do go to a fantastic sixth form institution, the chances are you will get into a good university. I think where the criticism is being levelled is for those students, and indeed, Gemma, you referenced this about employment support, who perhaps for whatever reason, don't want to go into university, don't want to go off to a Russell Group university after studying 2 or 3 A levels, and actually want some other choices that perhaps takes them more down the route of learning and earning at the same time. So apprenticeships is an obvious example of that route. Do you think, William, there is time for that debate now about how we get perhaps a greater balance between those two different viable routes?
I think there is, and I'm pleased that it's back on the agenda with Baker's amendment of the skills white paper. It is the right time to be having this discussion, because fundamentally it is the right thing to do. What I would suggest is that we want people to be doing this because not because there are sanctions in place, because you'll be taken to court if you're not doing it, but because as part of your DNA as an education provider, you need to be laying out options for all students. And it is a varied landscape. For example, 10 years ago, degree apprentices were not necessarily on many people's radars. They're increasingly popular. In fact, I think supply is outstripping demand for them, and earning and learning is a very sensible route for a lot of people. So it's the right time to have the debate. And I think all institutions, including ourselves, need to reflect whether we are doing that appropriately.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned there, William, the fact that you wouldn't necessarily support big, heavy sanctions. And one of the interesting things about the debate, the way it's progressing, is the thought that in future, if you're Ofsteded at Baswick and you're found to be in some way in breach of whether it's the old Baker clause or some revised clause that might be agreed in the forthcoming skills and post-16 education bill, I'm detecting from what you're saying, you wouldn't support that sort of heavy hand then of government coming down and saying parents are going to get the right to sue you in future if you haven't enabled them, for example, to go on and do a degree apprenticeship.
It's an interesting question because, I would like to think we are giving students those opportunities, and where we're frustrated as a provider is when we're not able to get into all the schools to speak to students about their options. So, on the one hand, I think there is a place for sanctions. On the other hand, I think we have to be careful about what's driving it. Is it the carrot or the stick? And for me, I think when providers aren't compliant with Baker, it's probably comes down to 3 reasons. One is a bit of snobbery. Maybe our students don't go on to do those sort of things, so they don't need to know about it. 2 is that schools may let a wide variety of providers in, but they won't let their competitors in. So they're letting some in, but not everyone. And 3, I think there might be a lack of understanding amongst all careers providers in institutions about what is actually available. Because as I said earlier, it is a shifting landscape and people do need to keep on top of it. For example, could all schools talk with insight around T-levels that are available in their area and what providers are offering them? And I'm not sure they're able to do that.
Yeah, well, of course, they are very new qualifications, but even so, recent surveys have showed that employer awareness, never mind parental awareness, is very low of these qualifications, T-levels, and indeed the government's putting a lot of store by them in the future. But Gemma, just coming back to you, I mean, in many ways, it's fantastic that you're going off to university. I mean, as a care leaver, by the way, less than 10% of our care leavers do go off to university, so you've already fantastically achieved. And in many ways, actually, you're still on a vocational route, aren't you? I mean, being a barrister is a vocational calling. It's a vocational role. It's just odd. I mean, I think you alluded again to this, William, that in our system of cultural snobbery, perhaps that's not perceived as a vocational path in the same way, for example, wanting to train to be an electrician or a plumber is. But indeed, they both are vocational routes at the end of the day. But going back to when you were at secondary school then in Brighton and Hove, do you think, and Bewick would have come in and told you about your post-16 options, do you feel that you did, though, get a sufficient breadth of information from a whole host of other providers that potentially could have tempted you away from Bewick and to have done something else? Or was your heart just so set on becoming a barrister you knew you had to go down this A-level and university route?
My heart, addressing the first point, I think my heart has always been set on law from a very young age, going in and out of the care system and having authority in my life from a very young age. I saw firsthand the advantages of having a good advocate, and I suffered the disadvantages of having a bad advocate. So I definitely think that a passion has always been there to go on into the law. But it was also more for me. I've always been someone that I like to describe myself as I will have my foot in many pies. So although I'm pursuing a career as a barrister, I won't turn down opportunities that, could take me off path for a little bit, but bring me straight back on. I've always been one to, I suppose, preach to my friends, to people I work with that, no opportunity or no experience is bad experience. You either learn from it or you learn from it either way if you don't gain from it. So I always think that's been important. But referring to the point about, it being in primary and secondary school, I actually went to Blatchington Mill. And again, very similar to Bewick, they were very good at putting opportunities in front of me. Not only myself, but, the school in general. But it's very difficult, like Will said, there's, you've got the three elements of some but all. Do you open up the floodgates and let people come through and overwhelm with information instead? Which it's quite difficult, because I do think that, when those opportunities are put in front of young people, they come at a period of time, GCSEs more so. So there's already immense pressure on those young people then to then start thinking about their career, and next moves can then put, even more pressure on. And it's often at that point that young people drop out, not necessarily drop out of wanting to go into further education, but they think, I just need a break.
Yeah, indeed they do. And indeed, we've got 700,000 young people under the age of 25 who are not in education, employment and training. I don't like using that word neat because there's nothing very neat about being cut off from any form of productive activity. But that is obviously a looming crisis as well. Look, I've just got a few seconds to sort of wrap up this interview. And I just want to get from you, William, your perspective on where we go next. I mean, what sort of reforms do you think, if any, there should be put in place around careers? I mean, I'm thinking, for example, government's just given a huge amount of money to this National Careers and Enterprise Company. Is that something that you interact with? Is that, do you get resources and support from a big national quango like that? If not, why not? Where do we go next?
Yeah, we do work with the Careers Enterprise Advisor Network. And I think the quick answer to your question now is there is a lack of capacity across the board for work experience placements, whether that's as part of your vocational BTEC program, whether it's because you're an A-level student who wants time in a law firm, for example, with Gemma, or whether it's because you're doing a T-level and you need your X hundred hours of placement to ensure you're successful on the qualification. And I think the government are trying to address that with capacity expansion funds. But COVID has had a significant impact on our ability to get students into workplaces. Some workplaces are doing some brilliant things digitally and getting around that, but I don't think it's necessarily the same as having feet on the ground. And for some careers, you can't be a plumber or a welder until you've had those experiences. Indeed. And need that practical workplace experience to be successful. So that's the challenge, I think, right now.
William Baldwin and Gemma Creamer. Fascinating discussion. Thanks so much for joining the programme today.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Bewick.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show. Great music from the 80s, 90s and 2000s. Time now for the One File Tune of the Week.
Are you wrestling with managing cost and resources whilst delivering a high-quality endpoint assessment experience? Does your current IT solution meet new regulatory arrangements and ways of working? Worried about data security? Need to gain Ofqual recognition? Creatio's helped more companies through the recognition process than anyone else. And because it underpins all aspects of a qualifications lifecycle, more regulated organisations use Creatio's system than any other. Contact Creatio. See how we can help.
Before the break, you heard another One File tune of the week. Don't forget, folks, that all the tracks we play on this show from the 80s, 90s and the modern day can be found over at our Spotify playlist. Just search for Skills World Live. Now, it's that closing part of the show where we like to end with an interesting guest or two. Joining me down the line this week is a man whose organisation last year celebrated its 100-year anniversary. I'm talking about the Institute of the Motor Industry, or IMI, and its chief executive is Steve Nash. Hi, Steve. Great to see you.
Yeah, great to be here. Great to be here. I wasn't there for the whole of the 100 years, but a good part of it.
I could tell you don't look a day over 21, Steve. And with those, for those that aren't listening on the podcast, but perhaps watching on the video chat today, I mean, look at those amazing guitars in the background. Do you want to say a little bit about those?
A sign of a misspent youth, I think. That's part of a much bigger collection, actually, which I've got in a building out in my garden.
Right. Okay. Well, all I can say is I wouldn't want to be the person who has to fill out your annual insurance policy. That's for sure. When you're renewing the premiums, it looks expensive. Right. On today's show, Steve, we've been looking at the issue of careers advice and guidance. What's your reflections on that whole subject? I mean, do young people at school and college know about the many careers in the motor industry?
No, actually, they don't. That's a challenging one for us because I think that there are many misconceptions about automotive. I mean, most people's image of automotive is set by Phil Mitchell on EastEnders or the bloke on Coronation Street, And I'm not denying that sort of element exists in places, the small backstreet garage. But I mean, the other extreme is really the other extreme, very, very high tech. And of course, with what we're going through, it's interesting that we were set up, you mentioned 100 years ago, in very similar times to this, when technology was kind of changing at an exponential rate. And of course, we are seeing the biggest changes we've seen for a century around electrification. We call it ACEs, autonomous, connected, electric and shared mobility.
Oh, I didn't realise that.
Yeah, and it's completely changing what our industry is, and so we need new skills. We need people with different backgrounds. The idea of people sort of getting oily and stuff like that. The cars we're dealing with going forward won't even have oil in them. So I mean, it's a very, very different job, and so we've got quite a job on our hands to actually attract people from different sectors, and to get in early, because I think we know that people's impressions or ideas about careers are developed very, very early in life. Probably pre-secondary school, actually, as long as that. So the sooner you can get to influence, the better.
Yeah. I mean, just on this point about a real fundamental shift, I mean, as you say, 100 years ago, we had the petrol combustion engine. That's been the mainstay, really. Okay, the cars, the style, the branding, the gadgets, all the things that as car drivers we've enjoyed over the years and have changed. But fundamentally, the way that we propelled ourselves around the country and on our roads hasn't really changed. But by 2030, the government, of course, has committed to this target of phasing out essentially the petrol combustion engine. So that's going to require, isn't it, whether it's on the technical side, frankly, a new breed of mechanic that understands these electric vehicles, on the wholesale side of manufacturing, battery technology, all the other technologies that will have to be reshaped and reformed. And then, of course, on the retail side, I mean, IMI, you cover aspects of the retail side of the industry as well, don't you? So trying to communicate all those different career options, never mind the changing skills set requirements, is going to be a massive undertaking, isn't it?
Yeah, we're unusual as a professional body because, of course, most people are. We're not unique, but we're unusual in the sense that we cover an entire sector rather than a specific type of job. So we have there are more than 150 roles in retail automotive alone. Wow. And then when you start to get into manufacturing and everything else, it's huge. That has its challenges. It has its good parts as well. I mean, we certainly have very broad and progressive careers to offer, but communicating that, it can be a challenge, certainly.
Yeah. So what's the one change you'd want to see from the Careers and Enterprise Company then, and the various other organisations that are in this space that are meant to be working with industry bodies like yours to get these messages and these signals into schools and colleges? Yeah,
to do that more effectively, to be honest, because I think the careers advice you get as a youngster, if you get any, and that's it is still extremely patchy. I mean, the last time we kind of surveyed a group of youngsters, half of them said they'd had no careers advice to speak of. The half that had, half of them said that what they got was not really of any great value to them, and that they still kind of got their greatest reference from their parents. And that's fine. I think we all understand that, but it's limited to their parents' own scope of experience, isn't it? I just find it extraordinary that 40 years on, the careers information system, advice and guidance just doesn't really seem to have moved on, frankly, from when you and I were at school. It's still about peer group pressure, isn't it? It's still about what parents want you to do. It's still, in part, it seems to me, about a lot of luck as well, where just you happen to end up when you do stop studying. But anyway, perhaps that will change with some of the reforms going through. Now, look, Steve, I did want to talk to you about the fact that, I mean, as a regulated awarding organisation, you'll be in the thick of the whole review of L3 qualifications and below. There's other reviews going on as well. As you know, this week we've had the skills bill at committee stage also take place. I mean, where's your take on where we're headed around all of that? Are you sort of glass half full or glass half empty, or you haven't quite made your mind up about it yet? No, I think, if I'm completely honest, I think I'm more glass half empty than I am glass half full. I understand what the government are trying to do. I don't understand how they're trying to do it. I think the obvious confusion that can result from when effectively more than one regulator.
This is Ofqual and the Institute,
particularly when the Institute is playing a dual role of being, in effect, a provider of qualifications and then the arbiter on everybody else's qualifications. And
I know, it's extraordinary, isn't it?
Well, it is extraordinary, and I don't think if you were I don't imagine anybody starting with a clean sheet of paper normally would come up with a system like that. We have other concerns as well. I mean, we've got something like 49 qualifications that are more immediately affected, or in terms of questions around future funding. Some of those are sort of covered alternatively through apprenticeship standards and so on. But we know that some of those are going to lose their funding imminently, and that the T levels that are supposed to replace them won't come in for another year. So you've got a whole bunch of young people who are going to be denied potentially the opportunity to take qualifications that could be useful for a future career. We're lobbying on that, but
well, that's another slightly odd, sort of bizarre consequence, it seems, about the direction of travel. I mean, who would have thought, under the kind of government we've got, that actually diversity and choice in something like qualifications in the upper secondary phase would in itself be seen as a bad thing, that somehow we're saying in the future, and in a sense this links back to the early discussion we're having about careers advice and guidance. I mean, how wise is it really to go down the track of saying to a 16-year-old, you've got to decide now between an occupational T level or the tried and tested academic route, and there's probably not much scope, not much choice.
That's so much the point, because a lot of those qualifications that we have out there in the marketplace currently are taken alongside other subjects, so that person isn't necessarily dedicating themselves to a future in the automotive industry, but they've got a sufficient interest to take those qualifications, but they'll take them alongside other qualifications. And it did seem like a system that wasn't broken, that's being fixed, if you know what I mean. But I think all along, and I guess that's where my response saying I think I'm more glass half empty than full, is that for the last several years, and you've been extremely eloquent in spelling this out, really. We as awarding organisations seem to have been demonised somewhat. We seem to be seen as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And I thought, you put it extremely well recently, where we constantly hear about this proliferation of qualifications. And it's nonsense, isn't it? Because in a market-led system, we're only allowed to keep the qualifications that funded that people are taking. If people aren't taking them, they come
exactly, and people and employers want to buy. I mean, there's absolutely no liability for the taxpayer. I mean, you could spend millions at IMI developing a whizzy new qualification, but if at the end of the day none of those retail motor outlets wanted to buy it from you, you'd be left holding the bill, wouldn't you? I mean, it's the idea that this is the taxpayer that's ultimately having to pay for the perceived proliferation and the failure. I mean, I've made this point in another article I wrote a couple of years ago about the fact there's 54 different brands of toothpaste on our supermarket shelves. I mean, it's dazzling, the amount of consumer choice out there, but government doesn't come in and say, we only want 2 brands of toothpaste, thanks very much. I mean, that's the sort of Stalinist North Korean option, isn't it?
You don't expect to be having this kind of challenge from a Conservative government, do you? Or to have the Labour government arguing for more of a free market situation. I mean, it's like the world's been turned on its head,
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's the topsy-turvy world we live in. Look, I've just got a minute, Steve, to get your reflections on the apprenticeship reforms. I know you've written to the Minister Gillian Keegan about this in the past. Obviously, there are issues as well about the operation of the levy. That's not particularly new. Other sectors as well are kicking up about it. I mean, from IMI's perspective, what do you want to see there happen?
I think the pandemic has not helped, because I think right now we're seeing the first cohorts coming through to the end of their programs. And of course, that's happened in the middle of very challenging circumstances. And it's pretty obvious that in many cases, the training organisations simply have not understood how different the standards are to the old frameworks that they were used to. And there's a lot of work that we're having to do on the ground to make sure that we help close that gap between what the student needs to have achieved by the end of the programme and what they've been taught, frankly, whether that's on the practical side or the theoretical side. You know what? I mean, I could talk for hours about
alas, we've only got 30 seconds.
I think they are what they are, Tom. We need to be given the freedom to help make them work. Again, it has to be seen that as EPAOs, as endpoint assessment organisations, it's in our interests to try and get the students through and to help the training organisations to do the best job that they can. I think that's what we're doing. I think we could have got here a lot easier if we'd been listened to more.
Well, let's hope that listening and acting will continue in the future as we work with our colleagues across the whole of the skills ecosystem. Steve Nash, Chief Executive of the IMI, great to talk to you today. Thanks so much for joining Skills World Live.
Great to join you.
You're listening to the Skills World Live radio show with Tom Bewick.
Can you believe it? We've reached the end of another show and a very important milestone. We've recorded 100 episodes of this podcast and interviewed over 200 guests. They've included former ministers, MPs, FE sector leaders, think tank bosses, acclaimed authors, social media superstars, and yes, we've even had a goat appear on this show. Time now, though, folks, to say arrivederci, because on Sunday, just in case you hadn't noticed, there's a certain European football final that's taking place down Wembley Way. Depending on when you're listening to this, you either think football could be coming home or, fingers crossed, it has come home. Alternatively, the Italian team will be saying ciao baby if they win as they depart these shores. with all the glory. Whatever, have a great weekend and get your tonsils now around the lightning seeds. And of course, the 3 lions. Goodbye.
We're not creative enough, we're not positive enough.
It's coming home, it's coming home, it's coming, football's coming home.
We'll go on getting back, as I'm getting back, as I'm getting back, as I'm getting back.
It's coming, football's coming home, it's coming home, it's coming home, it's coming, football's coming home, it's coming home, it's coming home, it's coming, football's coming home. Everyone seems to know the score. They've seen it all before. They just know, they're so sure that England's gonna throw it away, gonna blow it away. But I know they can play, 'cause I remember 3 lines on a shirt. Jules remains still gleaming, 30 years of hurt never stop me dreaming.
So many jokes, so many sneers, but all those also nears weigh you down through the years.
But I still see that tackle by Moore, and when Lineker scored, Bobby belting the ball, and Nobby dancing 3 lines on a shirt. Jules remains still gleaming, 30 years of hurt never stop me dreaming.
Remember to subscribe to Skills World Live at fenews.co.uk or just download the show from any one of your favourite podcasting sites, including iTunes, Spotify and Spreaker. Your world, Skills World.